In this video, we are going to be going through everything that went wrong this past year working on the Z, from some minor setbacks, big errors, things that were wrong when I bought the car, and what all we learned along the way. Now, I hate to interrupt the flow really quickly, but if you can consider subscribing, that'd be great. If you like, comment, all that boosts up my channel so it's more recommended. Really helps me out quite a lot. That's my plug with the channel. Also, if I don't mention it, then a lot less people sub. So yeah, that's it. On to the video! Honestly, working on cars is probably one of the weirdest experiences in the world. You initially wonder how, but if I described working on cars as the most stress-inducing relaxation method, I think everyone who's picked up a wrench would know exactly what I'm talking about. To spend hours upon hours working on a car, seeing improvements brings incredible joy. Dropping the wrench 7 times trying to get off one bolt though does not. I want to quickly mention what's wrong with the car from when I bought it, and this just includes needing new tie rods, it leaks, it was hit in the back and wasn't quite correctly repaired, and just some other minor mistakes where the hood doesn't align and it needs new belts, and there's an exhaust leak, just things like that, little inconveniences along the way. So those all need to be cleaned up, but I just wanted to point those out before I went on to the things that were my own mistakes. Now to start off, there's the front bumper. Putting a BRZ bumper on the 300 was much more of an impulse than a thought out plan. Filling the headlights actually went quite well, but obviously there were some flaws. In hindsight, what I should have done was to trim off the top of the original 300 bumper, trim the BRZ bumper, and then blend the two together so that way I could retain the OEM mounts. The bumper is currently held on by very visible zip ties, and they get the job done but are far from the quality that I strive for. And the second big issue is the area where I filled the headlights cracked multiple times. I credit this to not having enough layers of fiberglass cloth or matte. I went with a fiberglass cloth, which is much more random strands that can be ripped by hand before the resin is applied, and it worked well when I used it for the flares, but for the front bumper flexes, it needs more tear resistant material. As for the flares, I'm actually quite happy with how the fabrication and patching done turned out. It was all quite smooth and looked natural, but as far as the mounting, there was a bit to be desired. I mocked them up for the front, but as you can see, they're bent afterwards, which completely takes away from the effort that I put into making them look smooth. I took the time to mock and mount them, but as I didn't account for the flex in the front bumper, once I aired up, the bumper slagged slightly and therefore made the fenders bow out. The next issue was sanding the hood. I wouldn't say this came down to using the wrong technique as much as it came down to error through frustration and being impatient. As I wanted to get to a stopping point with the Z, I rushed sanding the hood, not moving up to higher and higher grits so that it was completely smooth and had no sand lines show through. I'm always pushing myself to try something new when I work on cars, and with the Z, one of those pieces was sewing a leather steering wheel cover myself, and I would honestly give it a 4 out of 10 rating. The black and red looked good, and the quality of the painting turned out well, until you pull back the leather a little bit and see that I didn't paint before I put on the leather, which was a big mistake. Secondly, the material I used to cover the wheel stretched a lot more than I was anticipating, which completely threw out the stitching and extensions on the fabric that I had to cover the 3 spokes on the wheel. Now, let's talk about the convertible add-on that I made. This was the quote-unquote big idea that I had for this car, and it's why I ultimately decided to buy this convertible and not continue searching the market for something else. I saw the potential and I ran with it. Custom fabricating something to this extent was definitely new to me. All in all, I'm actually fairly happy with how it turned out. The shape and the symmetry turned out well, but the finish was a whole other story. As I mentioned at the beginning, it had almost a perfectly smooth finish ready for paint, but water got in it after it sat outside one rainy day and peeled up all the filler and fiberglass from underneath, completely ruining the work that I had done. I decided just to spread fiberglass resin over top of the remains simply to finish it off so that I wouldn't take another 4 months on this project redoing the work that you had already seen me do before. As for the taillights, I had the same problem that I had with the Supra. The darn lenses snapped on me when trying to take them off. I think it may be a sign that I should be done working on taillights for a while. Perhaps. It's been fun, but for the time being I think it's a bit out of my skill set for the results that I would get. The diffuser I was really happy with for the most part. The mounts were a lot more solid than I had previously on the Supra. It's slightly crooked, but since it wasn't part of the car that I spent an immense amount of time on, I'm actually not overly upset about it not being perfect. Oh, the exhaust though. That was an experience. Once again, I need to shout out my friend Connor for essentially making the whole thing for me. For starters, the headers were a pain to get on, and I'd take them on and off multiple times, which definitely was not a blast. But for the exhaust itself, one problem is that the new exhaust leaks. You can hear the rasp of this in this clip. Now it's very important that I point out that this is not Connor's fault, or my fault in fact, but simply the bolts that they provided for the headers were really soft material and they stripped when trying to get it on, and I just haven't replaced that with the grade 8 bolts that I have. As for the construction of the exhaust itself, we definitely learned a lot of what we need to improve if we ever did it again. For starters, the placement of the flex pipe is incredibly important. Secondly, having the car only a foot off the ground is not the way to go. Dragging the exhaust in and out and in and out for what seems like a million times is not fun and led to some errors. As you can see in the rotation and the height of the exhaust tips, it just isn't quite right. And this may seem like it's something trivial to fix, but we measured, marked, tested, cut, remeasured, tested over and over and over again, and it would always be just a bit off, no matter how much we did it. Despite the flaws, the setbacks, frustrations, gallons upon gallons of coffee consumed while working, I'm glad to see how far it came. I really am. Each mistake that I made along the way is one more way that you can narrow down to doing something the correct way. It's a process, and I knew this going in. I knew there'd be plenty of mistakes. I had an idea that I'd get the car done in 4 months, and 12 months later, it just got to a stopping point and isn't even completed. I'm still happy to see how far I came. As I mentioned, it's incredible to see the work. I am by no means a professional on any account, but I learned so much more by doing it this way than I would have if I just bought a kit or something that already fit. That would have been gratifying, and I think what we can all agree on while working on cars is at the end of the day, as long as we're the ones who are gratified by the work that we do, then it's worth continuing on. It's an expensive hobby, but it's one that I cherish the times that I work on it. As frustrating as they can be, I know the reward is so much greater, and the experience is something that I'll never be able to get any other way. All that being said, Project Miata starts next week.